Okay, everybody, so welcome to this Eco Schools Twilight session on our climate action topic. The recording is in progress. If you have any questions during the session at any point, please do let me know. You're welcome to interject with questions at any point during the session, anything you're not sure about. I can see a question about having a copy of the recording. Yes, absolutely. We'll be sending out copies of the recordings and a PDF of the slides to everybody who attends today. So let's get started. So the first question that I have for you is, what are you hoping to get out of this session? So you've signed up to this session on our Eco Schools climate action topic. So it'd be really interesting at the start just to get an idea of what you're hoping to get out of coming along today, just so that I can kind of integrate some of that into what we're going to cover. Obviously, I've got a set of things that we're going to cover, but we can add some extra bits in if there's particular things that you wanted to get out of this session. So that'd be really helpful if you can share that. Ideas for things to do for the topic? Yeah, we're definitely going to be covering that. But I'll make sure we include plenty of those in what we discuss. More understanding of what is entailed for this core subject? Yeah, absolutely. So we'll be discussing a few different points that should answer that as well. Anybody else got anything particular that they wanted to get out of today? I can just see a couple of people are typing, so I'm just going to give it a wee second just to check what everyone wants to cover today. A better understanding of what primary schools can do to support? Yes, absolutely. So we will be discussing different options from early years through primary school right up to high school as well, but we'll definitely be talking about what primary schools can do. And yeah, ideas particularly for nursery. Yes, definitely. So we definitely want to make sure that this topic is accessible to everybody across all the spectrum of the age ranges that we cater for. So yeah, we'll be discussing some ideas for nursery and primary and high schools as well. Fantastic. So what we're going to cover in terms of splitting up the session today, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of climate change, just so that everyone's on the same page in terms of what climate change is, understanding the basic concepts and the science behind climate change and what's actually happening. We're going to spend a bit of time talking about what we can do about climate change, so in kind of general terms, and what you can do in your different settings to help with climate change and informing your young children and young people. And then we're going to finish off by looking a bit of climate action in practice. So climate action as a topic for eco schools, how you can put that into practice in your action planning. So what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of climate change? Just to get an idea, when I say the word climate change, what's the first kind of word or words that come into your mind? Because likely some of the things that you're thinking about will also be the things that are coming into the minds of your pupils. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing, everybody. So changing weather. Yeah, absolutely. So we've got changing weather. Any other things? What just jumps into your mind? Global warming. Excellent. Any other words or associations that you have? The future of the planet. Excellent. Our planet. Changing environments. COP27. You'll see there's a couple of just people typing, so I'll just wait a second. So quite a few different things that people are thinking about. Global warming, rising sea levels, extreme weather. So yeah, lots about change and thinking about the future, and also things like COP27, so political kind of things coming in there. Brilliant. So the other thing that I want to think about, what comes to your mind when you think of climate action? So that's the title of our topic. When you think of climate action, what kind of things come into your mind? Making positive changes to help the planet. Really good. That's a really nice thing. What we can do to make an impact. Reduce, reuse, recycle. Interesting. Excellent. What we have to do to make changes. So that's really interesting. So when we think about the different terms that we're using when we're describing climate change and climate action, these are things, these are things that will also be going through the mind of the children and young people that you're talking to. So, when we're talking about climate change, it can seem quite big and scary. There's a lot of kind of negative things. We're thinking about changes in weather. We're worrying about the future. We're thinking about all the political things that are going on around it. Whereas when we think climate action, it tends to be more of a positive thing. So we're thinking about the things that we can do. So we're kind of giving empowerment as well of the things that we can actually do. And it also tends to be more of a positive effect. What can we actually do to go out and help with this issue rather than just feeling very anxious and scared about it? So that's really good. Thank you very much for sharing all those. That's fantastic. So what I'm just going to have we go through next is just a bit about the science of climate change. So what is climate change? How does it work? So we're all on the same page with what we're talking about when we say climate change and terms like global warming, as you mentioned. So global warming and climate change. So we've got the Earth here surrounded by its beautiful atmosphere, and we've got the sun, very much not to scale, but away in the distance. And what happens is in a normal world, so we're thinking about world pre-humans here, so we've got no humans around, we're not worrying about climate change at the moment, we've just got the normal world. We've got radiation coming in from the sun, and what happens is quite a lot of that radiation bounces off the Earth and heads straight back out into space. So it comes in, it bounces out. But in the atmosphere, naturally, so this is all pre-human, naturally we have some greenhouse gases in the form of things like carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide, and they're just there naturally as part of the kind of physical properties of the Earth and the animals and plants that were around before we arrived. And what happens is when some of this radiation that's bounced off the surface of the Earth hits these greenhouse gases, that heat is then reflected back onto the Earth. And what that does is it makes things nice and warm. And this is a good thing. So this is one of the key things when we talk about climate change and global warming. These greenhouse gases are naturally there and they do a very, very important job. So if we didn't have these greenhouse gases reflecting some of that heat and keeping things warm, we'd be sitting around an average temperature of about -20. So the easiest thing to do is, if you're trying to imagine this, is look at the moon. So the moon has no atmosphere, hasn't got these greenhouse gases, and it's freezing cold when the sun isn't, minus, I can't remember what that is, -200, I think it is, when the sun is away from it. And it's hot enough to instantly pretty much fry an egg when the sun is on it. So we've got massive changes in temperature and the average is really, really cold. So we wouldn't be able to support life. Like, we don't find life on the moon. That's what the Earth would look like. So the greenhouse gases are good. We like them. But what's happened is that as humans have come along, we've taken this system that was working quite well, and we've added a whole load more greenhouse gases into the mix. There's a lot more around now than there were pre-humans. And so what happens is when more of this heat is reflected off, more is being reflected back in. So we're trapping more heat in. Let's take the analogy of a greenhouse. So more heat is being trapped in and we're getting hotter. Hence the term global warming. So climate change tends to work better as a term because often, even though the world is getting hotter, that's what's happening, a lot of the changes we see aren't necessarily warming. So we can get, sometimes it can be quite confusing when we talk about global warming, and we might have people saying, oh, well, but it's colder where I am. And that's to do with all the changes in the climate that are happening. So climate change is a better term to use because it describes all those changes that are happening. And we can track the greenhouse gases are going up over time. So we can look at carbon dioxide over time, which is one of the most kind of numerous greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it's not one of the strongest in terms of its reflective power, but there's a lot more of it because we've been releasing a huge amount of it. So just to go through what this graph shows. So this graph shows along the bottom years before the present, from 800,000 years ago to 0, which is now. So this graph was created in about 2018, so about 4 years ago. And then on the y-axis on the left, you can see carbon dioxide in parts per million, which is a number that you'll, particularly if you look at anything to do with the COPs, you'll see the number of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a measure that we keep a very close eye on for climate change. And you can see as you go along the graph that we've got quite a normal fluctuation. So this is the other thing, the climate does change. That's a normal part of how the Earth works, it's natural. So, and we can see, you can see at points, especially on the left side, we've got a warm period, so where the carbon dioxide's come up, it got quite warm. And then when it really dropped quite low, between 600,000 and 700,000 years ago, we had an ice age. So the levels of these greenhouse gases will affect what the climate does. And it's quite normal that we go through cycles of warm and cold. And the highest concentration that we've had in the last kind of 800,000 years was, you can see there, about 300 parts per million, a few 100,000 years ago. So that's the highest that we've got. And then if we keep going to the right-hand side of the graph, suddenly things start to change. Suddenly we've got this massive spike. And funnily enough, if we have a look when the first Homo sapiens arrived, so they arrived a couple 250,000 years ago, give or take. And at this point, we had the Industrial Revolution. So whereas we've got this natural balance, suddenly, with this massive amount of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, that were being released at that point, suddenly we've got this huge spike and we've got a problem. And we can track that. So we can look from the past 170 years. So we're going to look from 1850 down to 2020 from left to right. And this is what the average temperature has been doing. So this is just a heat map that demonstrates what the average temperature has done over the past 170 years. So you can see there's been some fluctuation year on year, but overall it's been getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. And that is because of us releasing far too many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So that's just to put everybody on the same page in terms of the science of climate change. So just as a summary, and things that are really key to point out when you're talking about this to children and young people, is that climate change is natural. So that is quite a key point to get across. We are not the originators of climate change. But what happens is, because of human activity, we're releasing lots and lots of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that's causing the climate to change too quickly. So that's the key point, is it's not that the climate is changing, it's that it's changing too much and it's changing too quickly. And that's due to human activity. So we don't want to get rid of all greenhouse gases. We certainly don't want to get rid of our atmosphere, but we do need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere, because we're just heating everything up. We're putting these big woolly blankets around the world and it's getting too hot too quickly. And so if we then think about what are some of the impacts of this, and these might be impacts that are already being felt by the children and young people that you're talking to in your settings. So we're getting flooding, and we had flooding just the other day due to really high levels of rain. Particularly, we're getting these really, as we had these really hot, dry summer, and we're getting these warm, wet winters. So we're getting a lot of flooding. We're getting a lot of wildfires. Again, as we saw this summer, lots and lots of wildfires because everything's so dry in the summer. We're getting more extreme weather because we're getting a lot of energy in the air. So the more heat that we have, the more energy is in the air. Changes in currents mean that we get different rain at different times, and we have a lot more air movement, which means stronger winds, more storms, stronger hurricanes. Everything just gets a lot more extreme in terms of weather. We also have things like melting sea ice. We've got sea levels rising that are affecting particularly island populations. And then we also have effects not only on the weather, but also on the animals that we share our planet with and the plants. So lots of animals are having to try and adapt to these changing environments. So puffins are a really classic example that are really local to us. So because the seas are getting warmer, the sand eels that puffins depend on are starting to move north. They're moving away in order to stay at their ideal temperature, and that means that puffins are having to travel further and further to catch them and bring them back to their chicks, which means that they're struggling to feed their chicks as easily. So more and more, we're having fewer and fewer chicks surviving each year. And that's just one example of a particular animal. And you can think of it, well, puffins could move their nests further north, and they can to a certain extent, although it's quite difficult for animals to modify their behavior quite so easily. But if you think about it, they can keep going north, but eventually they're going to run out of Scotland, and there's not going to be enough space. They're not going to be able to go far enough north to be able to catch their prey, and we'll lose puffins from this country. And that's happening, like I say, to a lot of different species, to lots of different species effects. So that's the science of climate change. So why climate action as our core topic? So our education team has kind of rebranded as Climate Action Schools, and that's really because we wanted to bring the focus of climate change and climate action to the fore of everything that we're doing. So everything that we're doing has a kind of an influence of climate action, and that was why we then changed our core topic to really reflect the importance of this issue. This really is the most important issue that we're facing at the moment. So we wanted to bring that to the fore and really encourage schools to participate and take part in that. So that's really why we're kind of moving to climate action as our core topic, and we want schools to be doing something about it. And that can seem a little bit kind of scary, or we've suddenly got to do climate change when we've been used to be doing litter and waste. And what do we do for climate action? How do we kind of convert this into what we're doing for eco schools? And we'll come to it in a minute, but as you'll see, actually climate action is a kind of easy one. You can fit it into pretty much every single other topic. So anything that you were going to do for other topics often will have you can have a climate action slant to it. So it can actually be a slightly easier one to cover in a way as a core topic, because so much feeds into of what you're doing already will feed into climate action. So that's a bit of an overview of climate change. So that's been a lot of me talking, but just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the science and background. So now we're going to have to think about what can we do in terms of about climate change. So what can we do in general, and how does that translate into what you can do as eco schools for your eco schools programs? So what can we do? So there's 3 key areas that are kind of things that you want to cover in terms of climate action in schools and anything else that you're doing in terms of climate action. So to start with, we all need to understand and care about climate change. It all starts from that. If we don't understand what's going on, we can't actually do anything about it. If we don't care, we're not going to be willing to do anything about it. So that's where it all kind of starts. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we're actually releasing into the environment, and potentially try and take more greenhouse gases out of the environment. And we also need to protect against the effects climate change will bring. So some of these effects are locked in. We're already seeing the changes in our weather patterns and our annual weather patterns as a result of climate change. So we need to be prepared for those are going to get worse, unfortunately, before they get better. So we need to be prepared and adapt to the changes that are going to come. So what I want to start with is really this first one, because this is really key. So, we can go into kind of doing all of the different activities that you can do, and there are lots of brilliant things that schools and nurseries are already doing. But the key one really to start with is make sure that everybody in your school understands and cares about climate change. That's the really big place to start. So how can you do that, and what resources have we got available? So in terms of learning about climate change, we've got climate education for teachers and educators. So this session that you've come to is exactly one of those. So it's a session that a session about what climate change is and what you can do. We did also offer a training session in partnership with WASDEC that was really focused on climate justice and climate change itself. We will be that wasn't a recorded session because of the nature of the session, but we will be repeating it. So do keep an eye on our training page. And so likely February, March time, we'll have this repeated session. So it's a bit more in depth than the session today, and a lot focused on climate justice. It's a really amazing pair of sessions. So hopefully that will be coming back February, March time. So do keep an eye on our training page. Just so you're aware, all of these sentences that are underlined there, that's all links to the specific pages where you can find things. So that I say this PDF will come out to you afterwards, PDF of the slides, and that'll have clickable links so you can go straight to these pages. So educating educators to start with, so that you have a good background in climate change and climate action and know what you're talking about. We also have our Climate Ready Classrooms programs. This is a really amazing program, mainly aimed at high schools, where we have some people from our education team will come out to your school and actually run a full day workshop on climate change and climate action, and making pupils climate literate at the end of it. We also have a primary schools version of Climate Ready Classrooms that we're currently developing. We have some resources already available, and we're developing that further. So do keep checking back on our Climate Ready Classrooms page as well for that. So that's a really good way to get involved if you want to just, have a really intense session to learn about how climate works. We are also still offering some online versions of this as well. So if you want to do it online, we can also do it online as well. We had a whole suite of sessions this year for Climate Action Week. So each year we do a series of live lessons for Climate Action Week. And we have recordings of all the sessions from this year. So we have a session for nursery and early years, 4 different sessions for upper primary, and a session for high schools. And they're all recorded and available on our live lessons page. And there's some really interesting workshops and things in there that you can dip in and out of and have a look at to get your pupils engaged more in the topic. For early years, so I know we at least one person asked about early years in nursery, we have a climate change social script. Again, these are all links, so you can just click on them when you get the PDF. We have a social script which explains climate change in a really simple way for younger children to understand exactly the basics of what's happening and what they can do to help. Also in our Climate Action Week live lesson this year, so in the recordings, we kind of read out this social script as a kind of story, as well as having an additional story in there from an amazing author that talks about the changes in our environment. So you can also get a kind of pre-recorded version if you have a look at the Climate Action Week sessions. And we also have a Keep Scotland Beautiful guide to climate change. So it's just a guidance document that's good for educators and then for also sharing some of the concepts and things with your children and young people. I can see someone saying, sorry, like, not a problem at all. Just so you're aware, the session's being recorded. So if you want to skip back, if you want to watch the recording to see the start, that'll be sent out to you. So there's lots of different things, different resources there to get you started in just that understanding and learning about climate change and what's going on. So just as while we're here, I just want to mention also the concept of climate justice. So this is something that is becoming, children and young people becoming more and more aware of, and something that we really should be thinking about when we're talking about climate change and climate action. Because climate change isn't just an issue about wildlife and the planet and biology, it's also an ethical and political issue. And really, climate justice is the acknowledgement that those who contributed least to climate change are also those who are now most vulnerable to its impacts. And when we think about that, often what we do, we tend to think about people in the global south, people from areas where we're having things like in Pakistan, we've got these massive floods. So even though people in that country contribute very little to in terms of greenhouse gas outputs, they're actually suffering the most. People in island nations where we've got massive sea level rises that are going to threaten their very existence. But also, don't forget that this is climate justice, and issues around climate justice are also the case in this country. So people from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds, people from ethnic minorities are often those who are going to be most affected by flooding, by all of the different issues that climate change is going to bring. So it's not just a case of climate justice as a global issue, it's also a case of as a kind of more local national issue. So it's something that you can really consider and have a chat to your children and young people about, who's actually getting more affected by this, and is that fair, and what can we do to make it more fair. And one of the really big things that we're trying to kind of promote in terms of thinking about climate action and climate justice is the concept that we've got this earth and we need to protect it and we need to safeguard it for humans for the future. And in order to do that, we need to start thinking about ourselves in a different way. And this comes into climate justice as well. So rather than thinking ourselves about consumers and all the things that we need to buy and filling our lives with stuff, we actually want to try and encourage children and young people to think of themselves as citizens, so citizens of the planet. And another way of kind of having an analogy for that is to think of us as spaceship Earth, which was an analogy coined by the astronaut Marshall McLuhan. So we're not passengers on spaceship Earth, we're crewmates. So again, it's just another way of thinking about it, of trying to get it into that idea in children and young people's heads that we're all in this together, and the way to solve it is to work together and all kind of do our bit. Excuse me. So that's kind of thinking about understanding climate change, thinking about the issues, making sure that everyone's aware and cares as well. So thinking about that kind of being citizens and crewmates concept. So all of that counts as eco-schools actions. So you know all of these things that I've described, just having discussions in class, using any of those resources that I've said to think about climate change and climate action, all of that can be counted on your action plan and in your application as actions towards your eco-schools climate action topic. So you don't have to be physically doing things. If it's just learning and improving understanding, that all counts. So let's have a think then, as well as the understanding and the caring, what can we do in terms of eco-schools and in general to actually reduce emissions and try and mitigate climate change? So at the moment, we're sitting in 2019 and we're sitting on a set of scales. And this is quite a good way of describing the concept of net zero to pupils. I'm sorry, I can just see a question about whether the presentation will be sent. Yeah, absolutely, Caroline. So the presentation will be sent out as a PDF, and we're also recording the session, and a link to the recording will be sent out tomorrow. So at the moment, it's like I say, the scales is a really good way of thinking and describing to, you know, really young children right up to older children can understand this concept of a set of scales. And what we're trying to do is achieve balance. So we want basically net zero is a balancing of the scales. So our outputs and our inputs of greenhouse gases are balanced. So at the moment, this is what things look like. So we've got some big blocks on this left-hand side pushing in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions that are pushing us down in this scale. So we've got transport, so in cars, buses, trains, planes, food. Our food system has a massive amount of greenhouse gases associated with it. We've got industry, so all the things that we make and we use. Energy. Now the energy box isn't too bad actually in Scotland. So this is for Scotland. Energy box is actually not as big as you might think because we've actually done really well in Scotland to transition to renewable energy. So we're using a lot more wind and solar power and a lot less coal and oil and gas power. So that box is getting smaller, which is one of the nice good news stories as well. So again, we're looking for positive stories here to really empower children and young people. So energy is quite a nice one to think about. Heating, so heating our homes, which is becoming a lot more pertinent, obviously, in the current climate with the cost of living crisis, energy bills going up, particularly for heating, lack of insulation and draft proofing in homes. It's certainly something that's really relevant and will be affecting a lot of the children and young people that you're talking to. And then waste as well. So when we're saying waste, we mean the emissions that come from most of the kind of waste system. So all the stuff that goes in your bin, it goes off to a landfill, and there's a lot of greenhouse gases come off as a result of that. But again, that one's got smaller because we're getting better at dealing with that. And then the last one, which appears on both sides of the scale, is called LULUCF, which is a little bit of a mouthful of an acronym. And what that stands for is land use change, and forestry. And basically that's how the land that we live on can help to absorb carbon dioxide or release it depending on how we're looking after it. So for example, if we chop down a forest in order to build a town, we're changing the use of the land from something that was absorbing carbon dioxide to something that's emitting carbon dioxide. So that's going to appear on that left-hand side of the scale and push things down because we're changing the land to something that's releasing more greenhouse gases than it was before. But we can balance on the other side by planting trees and restoring these habitats. And it's not just about trees and forests, because obviously we hear a lot about planting trees, which is good in the right circumstances, but it's also things like peat bog restoration. So peat bogs in this country are an amazing kind of land use that can really trap a lot of carbon. And digging them up is definitely a way to release a lot of carbon dioxide and a lot of greenhouse gases. Also thinking about particularly if you're working in coastal schools, but actually relevant for everybody, is to think about things like seagrasses and kelps. Particularly seagrasses might be something you've never heard of before, but they're basically just plants that grow and they look like grass growing in the seabed, and they actually have an amazing capacity to absorb carbon dioxide in particular and other greenhouse gases. So these kind of things, restoring and protecting these habitats is a good way to help tip the scales that way, rather than we've got to shrink the boxes and expand the ones on the other side. So how does this work in the context of eco schools? What can you actually do for this in terms of eco schools? So all of these kind of things will count in terms of your climate action topic. So what we need to do is we need to start shrinking some of those boxes on the left and expanding that box on the right. So what kind of things could you do? So for transport, you'll suddenly start to notice that some of these are things that you're already doing as eco schools topics. So funnily enough, we've got a transport topic. And a lot of the things that you might think to do for transport are also relevant to climate action. So, reducing the use of cars, encouraging active transport, all of those kind of things will be reducing emissions around transport. If we're looking at food, we're looking at the food and environment topic. So anything that you're doing that's increasing the sustainability of food production, or like what kind of food you're buying and where it's coming from, how sustainable it is. Also, a massive one is reducing food waste, which is actually a really easy one to do in schools and nurseries, is to think about waste and how much food is being wasted. It's a really easy win in terms of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with food, because if you haven't had to grow the food because you've only taken what you need and you're not wasting, suddenly we've got a lot less emissions associated with that. Also, food going into the bin, not compost. If it goes in the bin and goes off to landfill, that's also another massive source of greenhouse gases. So if you're looking at things like stopping putting food waste in the bin, but putting it in a compost bin and starting composting, that's another great climate action action that you might not think of as being about climate action, but it really is. Energy topic, again, we've got an energy topic. So anything that you're doing around increasing renewables, reducing energy waste and energy use is all really good. Our heat, thinking about our heating box, because that's again, big pertinent one at the moment. Again, anything around the energy topic, so turning down thermostats, doing things like improving draft proofing, trying to reduce where you're using heating in terms of energy use. We can also think about water as well as a water topic. So heating water is a massive user of energy. So if we can reduce that down, again, we're reducing any of the emissions associated with burning fossil fuels for energy. So anything where you're using less hot water for things, reducing the temperature of the water you're using, anything like that. Industry. So again, we need to shrink our industry, and really a lot of this comes down to the amount of stuff that we buy. Every single thing that we buy requires energy to make it. Even things that are recycled or sustainably produced, they all still need energy to make them. And really that comes into our litter and waste topic. So anything that you're doing in school to reduce consumption. So using less stuff, reusing, repurposing, anything like that. Recycling is also good because often that will use less energy than making something from scratch. But really anything that you're doing around reduce, reuse, recycle, someone's mentioned it earlier, all of that is relevant to climate action, because the less stuff we use, the less energy goes into producing it, the less greenhouse gases are released. And then finally, waste, again, that fits in with our litter and waste topic. So again, anything that you're doing to reduce waste. So again, reusing, repurposing materials so they don't go in the bin. Food waste comes down to, again, food waste is a really good one to have a look at in school or nursery. How you can reduce that or change to composting rather than putting food waste into a landfill. And then on our other side, we want to look at expanding that land use change in forestry. So again, with the topics that you're looking at, we're looking at really biodiversity and school grounds. So anything that you're doing to plant anything, whether it's trees, whether it's a biodiversity garden, whether it's shrubs or plants, whether it's growing a bit of your own food, whether it's, if you're in coastal school, if you're getting involved in things like seagrass restoration, you can go and plant seagrasses. Anything in your school grounds where you're improving the amount of plants and space for wildlife, that's all really, it counts as climate action because you're creating these spaces that will hold in carbon. So particularly planting trees and other plants is really key here. And that doesn't just need to be in your school grounds or your nursery grounds. Think about whether there's community projects you can get involved in, because that also ticks the community box on your 7 elements. So if you can go out into the community and share some of what you've learned, plant trees, plant things, create lovely spaces for wildlife in community gardens and other areas, that's another great thing that you can do as well. And also don't forget that anything that you're doing for climate action will also have impacts on global citizenship. So if you've got ideas for global citizenship, you can count these in climate action. So because, as I said, climate action is such a global thing, and when we're thinking about climate justice, we need to think about helping other people, making sure that everything that we're doing is fair, and not taking more than our fair share. So we can think about that in terms of global citizenship. And also health and well-being. So obviously climate anxiety, particularly in older pupils, is becoming more and more and more of an issue. And one of the best things we can do for climate anxiety is to empower young people to go and do something. So health and well-being comes into this as well. So you can kind of see again why climate action is really our core topic, because everything feeds into this. Almost everything that you're doing will feed in some way to climate action. Few things don't, but pretty much any ideas that you have will probably have some kind of link to climate action. And it's another quite good thing in terms of if you're thinking about trying to understand climate action and climate change for your children and young people, getting them to try and make the links. So if you're saying, okay, well, let's compost our food waste, how might that link to climate change? And how might that be a climate action action? And getting them to make the links and helping them through with those links can be a really good way for them to see what changes they can make and how that can have an impact. The other thing that you can do, particularly if you're thinking about global citizenship or kind of any of these topics, is also get involved in campaigning, encouraging children and young people to write letters, to write emails, to stage protests, to create posters and put up around the local community. Actually empower them to use their voices, because that can have one of the biggest effects. If you've got a whole school that's having a big campaign about something, it can make a massive difference in your local community and and actually on national stages. So don't be afraid to get involved in a lot of these campaigning activities as well, because they can be really, really good in terms of climate action. Okay, so just to give you a few examples of specific things that you can do, I've kind of given you quite a lot of ideas there, but some specific examples. One thing you could do is to calculate the carbon footprint of your school. So carbon footprint is a measure of the amount of greenhouse gases released to the atmosphere as a result of our activities. So you can do that for your school. We do have on our in our resources page and on our climate action resources page some guidance notes. So the guidance notes link you to a carbon footprint calculator, and it just tells you how you can fill it in. It's quite an in-depth activity. You could do it as a whole, do the whole activity, or what you could do is just use it as a kind of something to help you understand where some of these greenhouse gases are coming from. Even if you don't complete all the questions and do it exactly, at least it gives you a baseline and something to think about in terms of where your greenhouse gases are coming from. Something to mention if you are doing carbon footprints is to try and think about it in terms of, this isn't about just individuals having to change. It is, a lot of changes are going to have to happen at a lot higher level. So again, thinking about that campaigning and things, the idea of carbon footprints is to more think about the awareness of things that you can do and things that you can change, rather than a pointing finger going, your carbon footprint's bigger than mine, or yours is smaller than mine, and so I'm better than you. That's not what it should be about. It's more about, again, empowering and giving children and young people ideas that they can then go and kind of campaign to change, or that they are able to change at a school level. So just some examples again of what schools have done. So some schools that have kind of really got into this and kind of done some big changes. So we had Lauriston Nursery that did energy in our area. So they went out, they walked around the local area and tried to identify different types of energy, counted how many houses had solar panels, how many didn't. It was a good little spotting exercise, particularly for younger children, to help them engage in this. They also discussed things like where energy cables go and that they run underground. Also looked at different objects in the nursery and around, and thought about what needed energy to work and what didn't. So thinking about things like wind-up cars that maybe don't need any energy. So that's quite a nice one to do, particularly for younger pupils. Get them to go out and spot things. It's a great way to get them involved. Carnworth Primary, so a primary school, did a proper food waste mission. So they did lots of different things about assessing what type of food was being wasted and when. So they did a full survey of all the food that was being wasted. They also discussions with pupils as to what pupils were wasting and why. They did like audits and graphed them. They had a proper food waste week where they got children to audit their food waste that was happening at home. So again, think about what you can get children to take home. They also got, started food composting, looked at like what happens to food that's composting, and then they also did this kind of picture up here, which is like a plate promise. So they did kind of promises as to what pupils were going to do to stop food waste. So there's some really nice things that you can do around food waste. And like I say, it's one of the easiest wins really with reducing food waste, because it's not too difficult a thing to do. You're not really giving anything up in order to reduce your food waste. You're just thinking about things a little bit more carefully, and it has a really big impact in terms of climate action. And then Kinmiley's primary school got into more of the travel side of things. So they were encouraging active travel. So they graphed how many bikes and scooters were used to get to school. So they had a poster competition. They got links with Sustrans to help them to do help them know how to use bikes and use bikes safely. They had bike breakfasts, bike stalls. They led bike rides. They really got people into really encouraged the active travel, and they saw that they were like an increase in pupils. And you can see there's a drop again, which was due to the weather. So again, it's quite good in some of these things to track what you're doing, and then you can identify some of the barriers to making some of these changes, and then get people to think about ways around them. So it's really, really good for problem-solving skills. And we do have lots more ideas and resources. So on our climate action page, again, you will be able to click on that when we send you out the PDF of the slides. But our climate action page has loads of resources of ideas and things that you can try, that lots of different ones for different age groups as well. So do go and check that out. So there's lots of ideas there for you, but like I say, really, it's actually almost about going back to basics and just thinking about all of your topics and all of the kind of things that you're looking at for the school in terms of climate action, and thinking about actually what will be the effects on greenhouse gas emissions of some of these actions that you're doing. And you'll often find that then actually they cover climate action. So the final wee thing that we're going to do this afternoon is look at climate action in practice. So climate action as an eco-schools topic in practice. So how to actually apply this. So as with any eco-skills topic, any eco-schools thing that you're looking at, we want to start with what you would like to improve or change and why. So always thinking about aims. So starting with aims and targets. So really thinking about that as a starting point. So what are you aiming to achieve with your climate action topic? And it doesn't have to be anything spectacular. It can just be a small thing, but just thinking about what you're wanting to achieve on your green flag journey with your climate action topic. And hopefully you should be fairly familiar with our action plan template. You do not have to use this template. You can do whatever version you like, but it does have the kind of sections that we can think it's a good idea to think about when you're completing your eco-schools journey. So what your aims are, why, what you're trying to work towards and why, what actions you're going to do, some planning around who and when's going to do them, how you're going to check your progress, how you're going to measure what you've done. And really that is about checking your progress. How do you know that what you've done has worked? And then the evaluation bit at the end is really that, really excellent tool for reflection for children and young people. So looking back, what went well and why, what didn't go so well, what would you like to change in the future is really important. So what does this actually look like when we're thinking about our climate action topic? So here's just an example of one thing that you could do. Excuse me. So RSU. Maybe let's have a think about, maybe it's a good place to start to think about what are some of the issues around. So what you're thinking about, what's climate action looking like in your school at the moment or your nursery? So maybe you have a look around and you ask your pupils to have a think about things, and they notice that there's a lack of climate change awareness in your school or setting. So the children have noticed that maybe people aren't really aware of it or don't really care about it. So you might decide to have the aim that you're going to increase knowledge and understanding of climate change among pupils and staff. So don't forget about everybody in your school community, get them all involved in this. So some of the things you could do, so you've got your aim, you want to increase the knowledge and understanding. So we're going to sign up for climate ready classrooms. Oh, thank you very much, person who's going, that's brilliant. Nice
Nicola,
to have you.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. Can I just, I think Zoe, who's just leaving, and a few other people haven't put their names and schools in the chat, so I'm not entirely sure who is here, so just so that we can send slides to the right people.
No worries at all. Yeah, so if you haven't already, if you're here, if anybody leaves, if you wouldn't mind putting your name and school in the chat, that would be fantastic. I know a few people did at the start, but if you haven't already, pop your name and school in the chat. That would be brilliant, just so that we can make sure we know who's come and who hasn't. That would be amazing. Thank you. Thanks, Libby. Thank you very much. So one thing that you could do is sign up for climate ready classrooms. So if you're a primary school or a high school, you could sign up for climate ready classrooms and get access to the resources, or have someone come out to your school. You can also decide you're going to watch the Climate Action Week live lessons. So you're going to watch some of those back that are relevant to your age group, and maybe do some of the activities and use some of the resources, so everyone's got a bit more knowledge. And then you might decide to hold an assembly on climate change. So that's another thing you could do, is once you've done, maybe one class watches the live lesson and then creates an assembly that they're going to share with the whole school, so all the school know about climate change and why, and climate action, and what they can do and why it's important. So that's one area, particularly if you want to look at knowledge and understanding. Thank you everybody who's sharing their names and schools, by the way, that's fantastic. Another thing that you could think about is maybe the issue is that we've got a lot of greenhouse gas emissions from our school activities. So we know that there will definitely be greenhouse gas emissions, because there's not very many schools that are zero emissions. I think pretty much none. So maybe we'll aim to work towards net zero emissions for the school. Now that sounds like quite a big ambitious target, but remember, you don't have to have achieved your aims in your green flag journey. You just need to be working towards them. So don't worry if you feel like, oh, I can't achieve that. You can have these big aims and just work towards them over a series of journeys. Or you might decide maybe a more manageable target. Maybe you just want to reduce your emissions, either by a kind of set amount, or just in general, you just want to reduce your emissions rather than necessarily aiming for a net zero school. So one thing that you could do to start with is you might calculate your carbon footprint, just to give you an idea of a baseline as to what emissions are coming and going from the school. And I say, you don't have to do that in lots of detail. It can just be a basic fact gathering exercise to get an idea of where your emissions are coming from. You might decide to introduce some energy saving measures. So maybe you'll have light monitors to make sure that lights are switched off and whiteboards are switched off. You might have tap monitors to make sure that hot taps aren't left running. You might, for really young pupils, it's great to do things like, light monitors, make sure things are turned off. For older pupils, you could look at slightly more advanced energy saving, maybe look at things like thermostats, draft proofing, things like that. You might decide to try and do something positive in terms of that other side of the scale. So as well as trying to reduce your emissions, trying to actually increase the amount of capture of emissions from things like trees. So you might decide to plant some trees in the school grounds, or maybe in the local community. And then as a final thing, you might decide you're going to do some campaigning for change. So you're going to write letters to local businesses or MPs about where greenhouse gases are being released, and trying to campaign for them to be stopped. So if you're seeing things in the news that are relevant, it's really good to have thinking about keeping children and young people on point with what's in the news at the moment. So thinking about things like COP27, what could you write to your local MP to make sure that they're discussing at COP27, to make sure that the government is pushing for. You can really get involved in a lot of these things. So now I'd want you guys to have a think. Hopefully you've been inspired by a few ideas today. So I'd like you to have a think about what you can do in terms of your eco schools action planning. So we've got this issue that we are emitting far too many greenhouse gases, and these are not being balanced because we're just damaging natural habitats that are not then able to absorb those greenhouse gases. So does anybody have any ideas of aims or actions that they'd actually like to take forward and take to their eco committees and use for their eco schools journeys? So it'd be great if anybody wants to share any ideas that they have on how they'd like to put this into action. Oh, brilliant. So some actions around school grounds, planting things around the school. Brilliant. So again, if you're thinking about that, think about what you're kind of aiming to achieve with that in terms of climate action, having those links back to how, so that children and young people understand how that's going to work. Recycling bins, brilliant. So yeah, thinking about how much we can, rather than our waste going into landfill where it emits more greenhouse gases, and that's more energy for new things to be created. Can we recycle more things? Again, if you're thinking about recycling, really don't forget to also think about reducing and reusing at the same time. So we always want to think about, before something goes, even in a, whether it's a recycling bin or a normal bin, before it even gets there, can it be reused for the thing it was originally created for, or could it be used for something else before it goes into that bin? As long as what you're using it for doesn't mean it can't then not be recycled. So it's always be careful with reusing materials, repurposing them for art projects where you're maybe adding glue or sellotape and things that then make it unrecyclable. So do be careful of that. But yeah, recycling's great. Oh, that's brilliant. So that's, yeah, so there's been lots of changes in staffing in lots of schools, which does affect your ability, the ability to kind of keep a kind of steady momentum with eco schools. So that's great to hear that you've been able to get starting again. And yeah, see what your committees want to do. Oh, brilliant. Yeah, biodiversity garden, that sounds lovely. And growing own food to reduce food miles. Yeah, that's really good. That's a really good thing to do as well. So, and also think about when you're growing your own food, how you're growing it. So, try and avoid things like pesticides and herbicides, and think about, good soil health and compost and things like that. So if you have got your own compost bins, that's great because that's reducing, again, waste to landfill, and it's helping, children to understand that link between having this healthy food production and reducing and having climate action. Got the children to bring in their pumpkins to put in our composter. Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's a really nice. So it's even just little, one little thing that can make a massive difference. If we think about pumpkins that are going into landfill, they're releasing a lot of greenhouse gases. So that's actually a really brilliant one to get children to bring them in. Again, things that you can do around holidays and celebrations are really good ones, because often we end up with a lot of stuff. So things like, yeah, pumpkins into composters, thinking about doing swaps for costumes might not be an obvious climate action one, but it is, because every costume that gets reused instead of a new one being bought is less energy, less greenhouse gases being released in that industry box. So that's another thing that you can do. That's brilliant. And yet an assembly to show what climate change actually means. Yes, again, assemblies are really good for sharing that knowledge and sharing things around the school. Oh, Christmas jumper swap shops. Oh, excellent. So yeah, any kind of swap shops are brilliant, but I especially like Christmas jumper ones, because you can get it's a great opportunity for children to get like new Christmas jumpers and things. So yeah, any kind of swap shops, reusable sales, bring and buy sales, they're great. They're all working towards climate action as well. Winter coat swap shop. Oh yeah, I like that one. That's good. Yeah, again, especially things that children grow out of, but are still usable. So I often clothes tend to get a bit torn and ripped, and then they're not great for reusing. But yeah, things like winter coats, bikes, again, Christmas jumpers, these are all brilliant, and they all count towards climate action. So we've got some really great ideas there. That is fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing those. So that's the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions that they haven't asked already, please either pop your microphones on and ask them, or pop them in the chat now. If you do have any questions about the presentation today, please email me at nicola.davidson@keepscotlandbeautiful.org, or you can email our general EcoSchools email account, ecoschools@keepscotlandbeautiful.org, and we'll send you out the slides and the link to the recording tomorrow. So if you do have any questions, also please do not be afraid to ask us questions as well. We're always really, really happy to help with your applications and your green flag journeys. So if you have an idea for an action that you think is that really related to climate action? Is it not? Just drop us an email at any time, and we can let you know. Is that something? How that would link, or whether there's something else you could do, or if you're just a bit stuck for ideas and you just want some ideas, you can just always drop us an email with some details of your setting, and we'll help you with some resources and things. We're always really happy to share things if you're not sure. So please do not be afraid to ask questions and send us emails anytime you want to. So if nobody has any questions at all, thank you so much for coming. I hope it has been useful, and I hope it's helped you, kind of giving you some ideas as to where to get started with this new core topic. And like I say, any questions or queries, please do let us know. Thank you so much for coming. No worries at all. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.